and then we'll get started. Okay, I know people are still coming in, but I'll go ahead and welcome those who are here now. My name is Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PMP Live. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be dropping in the chat to purchase Take Up Space, the unprecedented AOC. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A. That feature can be found along the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, but I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, simply click on the live transcripts option, which is also along the bottom of your screen. And now on to our event. The candidate was young, 28 years old, a child of Puerto Rico, the Bronx, and Yorktown Heights. She was working as a waitress and bartender. She was completely unknown and taking on a 10-term incumbent in a city famous for protecting its political institutions. Women like me aren't supposed to run for office, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said in a video launching her campaign, the camera following her along as she hastily pulled up her hair into a bun. But she did. And in perhaps the most stunning upset in recent memory, she won. At 29, she was sworn in as the youngest member of the 116th Congress and became the youngest woman to serve as a representative in United States history. This evening, we have three panelists to talk about Take Up Space, the unprecedented AOC. They are Lisa Miller. She's a staff writer at New York Magazine. She's the former religion columnist for the Washington Post, former senior editor of Newsweek magazine, and author of Heaven, Our Enduring Fascination with the Afterlife. Andrea Gonzalez Ramirez is a senior writer for The Cut, New York Magazine's lifestyle, culture, and fashion brand. At The Cut, she reports on subjects surrounding communities of color, focusing on racism, classism, sexism, and other systems of power. Ryu Spaeth is a former features editor for The New Republic, currently deputy editor for Intelligencer, New York Magazine's news and politics site. In this role, he helps oversee the site's direction and day-to-day coverage and edits features for the web and the magazine. So without further ado, I will turn the screen over to you three, our panel, and I'll be back at the end to ask you the questions that the audience has put in the Q&A. Take it away. Screen is yours.
Thank you, and welcome to our panel. We're here to talk about Take Up Space, and this book is kind of a hybrid. Part of it is a biography of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that's written by Lisa Miller. And then there are a series of essays that are appended to it, including one by Andrea, that tackle different aspects of AOC and her reputation, her budding legacy. We kind of think of it as sort of a panoramic look at this phenomenal politician. So I guess my first question for Lisa is what is so significant about Ocasio-Cortez and what made her, the right subject for this kind of book?
mean, we've been asked this question before. Why did you write a book about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? And we've been working on it for so long that it seems like so completely obvious to me that she should be a subject for a book. I mean, she is the youngest woman ever to be elected to Congress. She is a woman of color. She is a working class woman. When she says women like me are not supposed to run for Congress, she's completely telling the truth. She was unprecedented. And her trajectory from bartender to political supernova has been so fast, and her influence and her has been so great, both in terms of people who love her and also people who hate her. She has become so divisive. She has been so magnetic from the beginning, that it seems like I was talking to a friend on the phone about this project we were working on, and he said she is a once in a generation talent. And I think when a once in a generation talent comes along, she is a completely appropriate, legitimate, fascinating subject for a biography and for this kind of panoramic look that we endeavor to do here.
And when the first time you saw or heard of AOC Andrea, did you feel the same way? Once in a generation, a phenom?
Not at all. I was working as a news and politics reporter for Refinery 29, with some women's media outlet. And we were covering women because it was 2018, was the year of the woman. And I remember going to my editors and saying that I was really interested in covering women of color running for office, because I felt that they face different challenges. You know, running as a woman is already pretty hard. Running as a woman of color, you are adding extra elements to that equation. I spoke with her, we profiled her shortly before her primary win. And I remember sitting down with my editor and being like, she's super interesting. I think that her platform is interesting. Her story is compelling. I'm Puerto Rican. I had not seen a lot of Puerto Rican women run for office like she was doing. So I found that like very interesting as well. But I did not think she had a chance at winning. I don't think anyone did, right? She was running against the king of queens, right? Like the fourth most powerful Democrat in the House. So if you had told me then she's a once in a generation politician, she's kind of like our first female wonderkind in the same league as Clinton or Obama or something, I would have been like, that sounds interesting, but I'm not 100% sure that's going to be the case. And I think that, you know, as Lisa said, her legacy already is like so compelling, and she's forged a path for so many people that it made her pretty much the perfect person to write a biographical project about.
But just to underline what you said, Andrea, there's a section in the book where DSA, New York City DSA, is debating whether to endorse her. Mm-hmm. And there's a chapter who's like, yes, the chapter in Queens was like, yes, definitely. She's amazing. She's so incredible. She speaks so well. She's so smart. She's so winning. She's so good with people. She's so charismatic. She's so fluent in being able to articulate like the moral imperatives of what she's after. And then there was a group of DSA members in the Bronx who were like, basically like, she's okay. And it is really useful to remember that there was a time when, before she was AOC, where she didn't have that like, of courseness to her, where people were actually really debating whether she could do it, whether she had the stuff, whether she could make it, what her weaknesses were, what her strengths were, whether she could play the game, you know, whether she was too green, whether she knew enough. Like, they were having all of these conversations about her as she was before her primary. And I just think that it's super important to remember that she was just a person.
Well, why don't you also, you know, take us back a little bit to that time? You know, it was more than just her individual talents or skills. Like, there was something going on in 2018 that helped give to her rise, right?
Right. Well, I mean, so Brand New Congress, which became morphed into, is adjacent to Justice Democrats, was a group of people who were in the Bernie Sanders campaign. And when he stepped out of the presidential election in 2016, decided that they were going to launch this enormous project and sort of overturn Congress with, working class people who had sort of Bernie principles, working class community leaders who were invested in a kind of economic analysis of American problems, but who weren't tied to big business, who weren't tied to political legacies, who didn't owe anybody any favors, who they were looking for teachers and coaches and librarians and normal people who they were talking about repealing and replacing Congress. And so Ocasio-Cortez had canvassed for the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016. And her brother nominated her when Brand New Congress was looking for community leaders to run for Congress. And she was like, the quote is, okay, F it, like, whatever, she said, like, okay, I'll try this. Again, not a auspicious moment, not a moment that like resonated with, future potential. It was just like her brother called her up on the phone and said, do you want to run for Congress? And she said, okay. And he nominated her. And yes, so there was this, in retrospect, you can use the word machine, but it wasn't really a machine. It was a bunch of people who worked for Bernie, who believed in Bernie's principles, who wanted to scale it, basically like you would scale a tech product. And so they were looking for a bunch of people who they could back and help with the sort of back end of campaigning and put into Congress in the 2018 cycle.
And Andrea, I know you covered some of that race, and we've talked a little bit about the fact that she's a woman and a woman of color. And when you read this book, actually, it is striking still how rare it is, and the unique challenges a candidate and then a lawmaker like AOC has. Like, in your reporting, Andrea, when you're covering that race, like what challenges or what unique difficulties did you think AOC had?
Mm-hmm. So of course she was not a household name, right? She was a regular person. So just starting even with the support of a group like Brand New Congress, it was like really challenging. Like raising money was challenging. She we've seen her shoes displayed, right? Like she literally walked so much across New York's 14th district that her shoes were trashed completely, right? So I think that there was that element of like her being really scrappy with like community organizers in the Bronx and Queens and really trying to get her message out there. But also imagine that a really young woman of color, Latina, like knocks on your door and says like, I'm gonna go to Congress and change stuff. Most people are not gonna take that seriously. We take men seriously when they say that, right? One of the challenges that we hear from groups that do recruiting of like women and other marginalized genders is that, more often than not, a man will look at himself in the mirror and be like, I can be a senator. Women need to be recruited over and over and over again in order for them to say yes, even when their resumes are stellar and they're super qualified and they've served in different roles. AOC was a bartender, like, right? She was just like a fellow millennial who did not find like the path she thought she was gonna find after college, which I think made her very relatable to a lot of people. But also because she was so young, because her resume was different, because she did not have political experience, I think people did not take her seriously, and Joe Crowley certainly did not. He had a war chest of millions and millions of dollars compared to her, but he did not show up to debate her. And the first time that they basically were face to face in a televised debate instead of a community one, he was very dismissive. He did not really think that she could do it. I mean, no one really thought she could do it. And yet, you know, here we are now talking about her rise in politics and, you know, the really impressive legacy that she's leaving behind already.
I mean, there's another story in the book where one of her early communications people was taking her around to try to sell her essentially to some of the established political groups in the city, especially in New York 14. And, you know, she is very winning. She's very likable. People like to see her in their living rooms. There were all of these like little living room get-togethers when she was launching her primary campaign. And so people would be really interested in her, you know, and then at the end, this marketing person said, you know, and then at the end they'd say, we appreciate your spirit, kid, but we're going to vote for Joe Crowley. And so it's like this, like, yeah, you're good, but you know, you're little, you're Latina, we can't pronounce your name. Like you're nobody from nowhere. Like Crowley had such a ginormous lock on his district and had for so long. And you know, he wasn't terrible. He was just fine. And so she really had a high bar. She had to pitch herself as the alternative to this person who was doing okay in his district. He had a lot of loyal voters. He was potentially going to take Nancy Pelosi's seat. He was very powerful in Congress. And there was this sense in New York 14 that he could actually like deliver for the district. And who was she? She was nobody from nowhere. And how was she gonna, even if people had their complaints with him, how was she gonna deliver for the district? And so she had to position herself. I mean, Andrea used the word scrappy, like that's like exactly right, like scrappy times a billion, right? She had to position herself as like all of these things about her were advantages. She was young, he was older, she was brown in a district that's majority minority, he was not. You know, she was millennial in a young district, he was not. You know, he had moved his family down to Washington after a while and basically lived there. And she gave this like famous line in that debate that you just mentioned, Andrea, which was like, he doesn't drink our district's water and he doesn't breathe our air. Like she just mopped the floor with him during that debate. But the way that she positioned all of her weaknesses as strengths so that she could vanquish this politician who really was the embodiment of, you know, democratic sort of center left establishment power, was like, you can say what you want about Justice Democrats and you can say what you want about brand new Congress, but that was her understanding where her strength was.
I remember late in that campaign when it started to go a little bit south for Crowley, they tried to make a big deal out of the fact that she grew up partly in Westchester, as if to imply that, you know, she was like actually secretly wealthy or something. And a lot of the biography is actually about her early years and some of the most revelatory stuff. And so what was Westchester for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez?
Andrea, do you want to take this, or you know about
her? You go, because you wrote the biography part, so you go.
Andrea wrote a wonderful section about her. She went back and forth to Puerto Rico a lot when she was a kid, and her mom was born there, and her whole family was there, and then many of her dad's relatives were also there, and she and her brother would spend summers in Puerto Rico, especially when her parents were working and they didn't have any childcare. So the reality of Yorktown Heights was that the family moved up there when Alexandria, who was called Sandy as a little kid, became school age, and they wanted to find a good public school for their kids. And they lived in the Bronx, and the schools there just weren't good enough. And her parents were ambitious for her, and they wanted her to have a like good education. And so they moved, they got some money from, they pooled money with family members and bought a very modest little house up in a corner of Yorktown Heights that is a very working class corner. It's a suburb that has very high highs and lower lows. Like there's some really, really fancy parts of Yorktown, and the high school that she went to had a lot of really rich white kids who played lacrosse. Was a big sport at the high school that she went to. But she was a working class kid. Her mom cleaned houses for a living, and her dad was an architect and commuted to the Bronx and had a little business where he fixed up apartments in the housing development that they had lived in the Bronx. So they had, you know, a pretty modest, not poor, but modest household. Her grandmother lived with her for a time. And so she grew up with a like strong class awareness of being a kid who, you know, wasn't like the other kids in Yorktown Heights. And yet, you know, she's likable. She's a good student. She belongs to clubs. She's not, you know, she's not putting a stake in the ground. She's a kid. She goes to Girl Scouts, she goes to church. And so, but you can see from the people that we talked to, the way that class consciousness kind of sat with her, right? Like it sort of ingrained itself into her, who she was. And she became sort of good at code switching, at being what people expected her to be when and reading what that was. She's an incredible communicator. We see that now, but she was an incredible communicator then. And people noted that about her, but she was able to communicate to people in the language that they needed to hear. And that is one of her most, notable gifts, right? She speaks Twitter to the people who speak Twitter, and she speaks Instagram to the people who speak Instagram, and she speaks congressional testimony to the people who speak congressional testimony, and she knows how to speak all of these different languages in order to reach all of her different constituencies. And that is something that she learned as a child living between Westchester and the Bronx and Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm. I would add too that growing up, she had like a really strong relationship with her dad, Sergio. And even though she had that class awareness, I think that Sergio was very much a Puerto Rican dad in the sense that it was like, kid, you can do whatever you can. Like whatever you set your mind to do, you can do it. So she grew up with like that type of aspiration and that type of drive in many ways, because for better or worse, that's what like her dad like taught her since she was little. And I think that we see that now, like in the way that she's evolved as a politician, right? Like she's taking it in and like learning how to adapt and learning how to grow. And the way that, you know, she came out into Congress like a very much insurgent left, we're gonna like replace and primary some people. And then like she got rid of some of her staff and then replaced them with people who were more insiders and started forging like relationships with people in Congress, and kind of like toning down some of her rhetoric. Because I think in many ways, like her dad was like the biggest influence in her life. And she still takes to heart the fact that he told her, anything you want to do, you can do it. And going back to the relationship to Puerto Rico, I think that also influenced her. For people who are the kids of Puerto Ricans who were born here, it's very much like a ni de aquí ni de allá, like neither from there or here feeling, right? Like you go back to the island and you have like a strong like accent when you're speaking Spanish, so people don't see you as like a fellow Puerto Rican. Stateside and people read your full name hyphenated like mine, and like maybe see the color of your skin, and they don't read you as others. So I think also with the class awareness, she also had that sense of like not fully belonging like anywhere, which is why she was so highly adaptable and like, okay, well, if this person is not gonna read me as someone who belongs here, then I'm gonna like speak their language to ensure that they know like, yes, I do belong in this club, or I do belong in like Boston when I went to college, or I do belong in like, running for Congress.
So do you think that, that sense of being sort of part of Yorktown Heights, but not part of Yorktown Heights, and being part of Puerto Rico, but not, Puerto Rican in some ways, is that advantageous? Like, is that like, or is it also something that one invites all kinds of attacks and makes her like alien to certain people and, that kind of thing?
This is the first time I've ever had this thought this exact way, but it's like the opposite of privilege, right? When you have a lot of privilege, you can just walk into the room and you can say, this is who I am, these are my credentials, and this is my resume, and you have to accept me on my own terms. Whereas a person like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has to keep putting on different using different language for different constituencies, for different people, so that they will accept her. She said once about Crowley, he's not somebody who's ever cried in the walk-in refrigerator because somebody asked for still instead of sparkling. Like that experience is so integral to who she is, right? And yet, like, we're talking a lot about her flexibility and her adaptability and her sort of fluency, but I also think that, as Andrea says, like Sergio's faith in her, which was a faith that she had in herself, keeps her still from becoming a chameleon, right? She's the opposite of a chameleon too. She's very strong. She's very like, this is who I am, and I'm not wavering from that spot. It's just the way that she communicates that's flexible, not her identity in itself.
Yeah, I would say like her moral compass, if there's something that she's done, is like her moral compass has not really shifted in like all these years, despite the attacks, despite like the backlash she's received many times, because I don't know, like she did not do a symbolic vote in the way that like some parts of the left wanted her to do. I think that her moral compass is really strong. And I would say like, I don't see this sense of not belonging as like an advantage, but I think that she's like a very strong person who is capable of turning pain into purpose. I mean, because Sergio had like all these big dreams for her, and like one of the last things that he told her was like, go make me proud before he died. She did not feel for the longest time like she was making him proud, right? Like she was not working in the field that she graduated from. She had student debt. She was a bartender. In like she was struggling like in many ways, paying a crazy healthcare insurance plan for a crazy healthcare insurance plan, paying her student debt, being yelled at by customers who wanted like still water and she gave them sparkling. So for the longest time, I think that she did not feel worthy. And it wasn't until like the Bernie campaign that she really like was like, oh, like actually I am worthy of like respect, and I'm worthy of, having access to a lot of things that for the longest time our system has told us like we don't deserve because we did not work hard enough. And I think those experiences were like very much formative, and why her moral compass is still very like strong, despite all the push and pull that we see her deal with in Congress.
Right, because as you've foreshadowed, she does change in Congress, right? She does adjust. And do you think, and it's for either of you, do you think she's lost any of that moral sort of power that she had right at the beginning, like when she was, really pure, or is it just being a smart politician? Is that how you wield power? And
I think she's strategic, and I think it goes back to, I mean, like some of the closest people to her, including her partner, come from a very like tech worldview, right? So you're always iterating and you're always shifting and you're always growing from your experiences. So I think that once she came into Congress, she realized like, well, the way I'm doing stuff may get the message out and may help shift that overtone window she talks about, right? Like making things that seem very radical a few years ago feel more normalized now, like something like the Green New Deal. But she's not getting any friends. And she realized that if she wants to like do stuff and actually get stuff accomplished and have some longevity, she's gonna have to adapt. And I think that with everything with her is like, it really depends from the lens that you're looking at her. Some people are gonna see it like as hypocrisy and her being just like yet another politician. And there's some people that will see it like, well, maybe this is strategic. And there's some people who are like, maybe it's a little bit of both.
And the other thing is, it could also just be seen as a maturing process, right? She came to Congress and she was really young, and she had never been in Congress before, and she was elected on this platform of being an outsider by outsiders who believed in being outsiders, and so they came into the Congress into sort of with a lot of outsider swagger, and they were empowered by that. I mean, that was what got her elected. And I think there was a moment where she started to understand that you can't be an outsider forever. Like, you're just by virtue of being a member of Congress for 2 years, you're no longer an outsider. You're walking the halls, you're eating lunch with people, you're on committees. Like, it's very hard to maintain that status. And so she had to figure out how to retain this kind of moral line, because that is what is her sort of stock and trade, right? That's her currency, while also being a colleague, being a player. And I don't think that's easy for her. I think it's probably more comfortable for her to be an outsider. But, she's been reelected now. She has more money than almost any other member of Congress. Mm-hmm. She has a lot of power, not just in her the number of social media followers that she has, but in the amount of money she can raise overnight. So she's a kind of, in those ways, she's a more conventional politician than she was when she entered politics. And she has to deal with all of that. And it can't be easy for her. She has made some mistakes, and she has also, as Andrea says, made some choices that have really pissed off the far left that elected her.
Mm-hmm. I would say too that because she has that moral compass, one thing that really struck me when she started campaigning for Bernie again in 2020 was that they had a little bit of conflict because, of course, his message is like Medicare for all, right? Like, that's what we want. And then she had, like, I think it was an interview where she said, would it be the worst thing in the world if we don't get Medicare for all, but like we still get a public option, which 10 years ago, like, was completely dead on the water. And I think that is just like a really like high wire act that I don't think anyone would want to be in her shoes. Like, I know personally, like, you cannot pay me enough money in the world to live as her for like one day, because she's just dealing with so many like pressures at the same time. And, like, she has a ton of self-awareness, like of, her limitations, I think, but at the same time, she still believes in the same way that Sergio believed that she can do it. So I think there's also a little bit of arrogance there that any politician should have if they want to do what they do. So it's just like a very complicated life she lives, and I don't think anyone would want to be in her shoes, to be honest.
She used to say early on, after she'd been elected, and sort of in the months after she'd been elected, but before she was sworn in, many, like around the time of the Sunrise protest, she was saying over and over, the maximum amount of power that a person can have is to be able to say F it. And I think that's what you're talking about, Andrea. I think that this kind of like, how do you be a vested politician with a constituency and a lot of money in the bank and lots of people watching you and criticizing you and devoted to you, and also retain the inner knowledge that at any point you can say F it. You know, she always drops these little hints that it's part of who she is. You know, she said a year or so ago, like, I'm gonna go and have a farm upstate and what did she say, like raise llamas or something. I'm not sure it was exactly right, but like she does say over and over that there is this part of her that could just walk away at any moment. And I think that gives her a lot of power. That gives her a lot of her power.
It's certainly different from like the kind of power that Joe Crowley had, which was just to, you know, continually amass more power, more influence, all for some, you know, probably long-term goal of becoming like speaker one day, right? And like AOC it doesn't use power that way. In fact, the way it seems like she can still be an outsider is to use her incredible fundraising and her incredible social media presence to basically make the Democratic Party more liberal, more progressive, right? With these endorsements, you know, pushing the party further left. And you know, what do we think about those efforts, or how successful they've been, or how transformative they've been?
I mean, I keep thinking about Texas, right? She's had her eye on Texas since before she was elected. She keeps saying, we're going to turn Texas blue. Just watch it happen. And she said it again on the night that she was elected in the general election. She was giving her victory speech, and that was the night that Ted Cruz beat Beto O'Rourke, and that those results were playing in the background as she was giving her acceptance speech. And she stopped her speech and she was like, we're gonna turn Texas in this generation. And when you watch the way she handled Ted Cruz during the failure of the electric grid last winter, when Texans were freezing to death and Ted Cruz was going to Mexico on vacation with his family, if you all remember this, she didn't say anything directly to Cruz. She merely raised, I don't know, $2 million, $5 million. I can't remember the number exactly, but just like a gigantic amount of money overnight for Texans who were freezing because there was no electricity. And then she flew down to Texas in the middle of the pandemic and gave out sandwiches and stuff. And you just think like the images and the power that she was able to exert on this particular issue was so focused and so aware of all of the optics, what it was going to look like. Cruz, she didn't have to say anything to or about Ted Cruz. She could just do this and have everybody watching. And I mean, I just thought it was an incredibly effective use of her power, both in terms of raising money and in terms of motivating her social media feeds to a cause. She can pick a politician and raise money for them. I mean, it's an incredible toolkit.
I would say too that she's very conscious of the limitations of trying to change her colleagues. Like she has said before that if this was any other country in the world that did not have like a two-party system, someone like Joe Biden and her would not be in the same party.
Right.
So I think that she understands that like she can only push her colleagues so far. What she can do, however, is start to move like, again, the Overton window to make things more accepted, like something like the Green New Deal. When Biden organized all these committees right before the 2020 election to kind of like come up with plans for if he was elected, she was in the environmental committee with the climate change one with John Kerry. And the plan that came out of it was basically the Green New Deal without the name Green New Deal, right? So she's trying to make these ideas more popular in order to then push like someone like Joe Biden to say like, okay, maybe this is like the type of plan that we want to include in like my presidential platform, right? But it's like she cannot do it by herself. Like, and I think a lot of people ascribe her so much like almost like messianic like power, right? Like she's the one that's gonna save us. Like, oh, I mean, Lisa has said this before, but in one of her first major interviews after she won her primary, I think it was in The View, she was asked when she was gonna run for president. And she was not of age to run for president, right? She had not even been in office yet, and people were just like projecting all of this in her. And I think that, you know, she definitely, I mean, she's very powerful, but I don't think she's that interested in trying to change her colleagues. She just wants her colleagues to adapt to the times. And the way to do that is to push out her message and like make a lot of like this very lefty ideas more popular with like a lot of other communities around the country, not just New York 14.
Well, I mean, I think even her, you know, sort of most vicious haters like have to recognize that, you know, AOC is a force. But what do we think, like, you know, what are some missteps she's made? I mean, she's, where is she maybe, overstepped or sounded a wrong note? What do you think, Lisa? Like,
I mean, I think that there was definitely her first chapter in Congress where she brought the Justice Democrats inside Congress to run her staff. I don't know that you would call that a misstep initially because you bring who you know with you, but her director of communications and her chief of staff were both basically the founders of Justice Democrats. And they had this real sort of anti-establishment, anti-institutional, anti-traditional take on what politics should be like. Neither one of them had ever really worked on a political campaign before or staffed a politician before. And she was using them as surrogates. So when she didn't want to go on TV, she would put one of them on TV. She was violating all kinds of protocols within On the Hill. And that kind of upstartness didn't go down well with her congressional colleagues. And she initially stood by them. These are the people who brought me to the dance. These are the people who got me elected. These are the people who know me best. These are the people I know how to work with. But there were a lot of people saying to her at that moment, like, this is not how you make friends here. This is not how you get stuff done. These people are not helping you. And in the end, there was a big conflagration with Pelosi, basically, and her side of the party, the more centrist side of the party. And she had to let those guys go. And I think that her letting them go was an acknowledgement that kind of outsider brash, we're going to do things the way we want. We're going to primary people. We're going to, it's one thing to primary people when you're a challenger. It's a completely different thing to primary people when you're a sitting member of Congress. I mean, it's just like the optics are different. The dynamics are different. The threats are different. You're going to primary somebody that you're eating lunch with. You're going to primary somebody who you're sitting on a committee with. You're going to primary somebody who could be an ally to you. I mean, all those dynamics are really, really different. And so I guess I think that I wouldn't say that her bringing those guys into Congress was a misstep, but I think that she was right to let them go and that she needed to assert her independence from them and from her Bernie roots and from and assert her own identity, political identity, at a certain point, and to cut her losses. So that would be one misstep that I would that I would name.
I also think that, like, in terms of her messaging, I can think of something like the Met Gala and her showing up to it as like something that, you know, it did seem like a miscalculation. I think that she thought it was gonna be much more well received than it was. Because I mean, again, like, it's about optics and like, you know, yes, there's this sort of like FU element to where addresses as tax the rich to a super uber rich, like, you know, one of the most coveted invitations you can get for certain industries. But at the same time, is it really that much of like a FU to them, right? If you're still like coddling with them and you're still like hanging out there like throughout the night. So I think that sometimes she's pulled back a lot from her social media, I would say. I don't think that she's like clapping back as much as she was at the very, very beginning, where there was like headline after headline after headline. But like that to me felt kind of like pre 2020 AOC move, instead of like the move of someone who had already kind of like got a sense of how to play the game in Congress in a way.
Yeah, I totally agree. I thought that was a sort of odd moment for her, and sort of uncharacteristic for her, because normally she can balance those things really well. Also add maybe, you know, I thought AOC and the Progressive Caucus in general like handled congressional negotiations over Build Back Better and whatnot, and actually pretty well. But in the, you know, but then her and the squad didn't end up voting against this big infrastructure package in a kind of protest move that I'm not sure really, you know, certainly didn't do much for constituents, but like, I'm not sure it ended up actually having an effect politically that she wanted.
I don't know. I think she's always weighing her moral legacy against her pragmatic efficacy, right? And you know, she loves Barbara Lee, and she tells this story about how when she was before she entered Congress, she reached out to Barbara Lee for advice. And she said, you know, how did you handle the hate from your congressional colleagues when you voted against the bill that would allow presidents to basically declare war without congressional approval after 9/11? And Barbara Lee said something like, you put your stake in the ground and you stand by it and you wait till everybody else comes to you. And so I see the vote against Build Back Better, she knew it was going to pass. So it was, in a way, it was putting her stake in the ground and asserting her position in order to make a point. And we'll see how that goes down over time.
Okay, we have, I think, something like 10 minutes. We have questions from the audience. I can read them, actually. That might be the sort of easiest. Here's a good one. I have deep respect for AOC, but I live in a Republican area. She's hated here. Does she understand that her ultra-progressive ideas are deeply unpopular in large areas of the country and help turn people away from the Democratic Party?
So I can speak to this a little bit. AOC has this vision, which I respect, but I'm not sure is achievable. And her vision is to assert an economic analysis of American class structure so well that gig workers in California and fruit pickers in the South and restaurant workers in New York and laid off factory and auto workers in the Midwest, who tend to vote Republican, all understand that they're being screwed by the same system and they can form coalitions together. And the original AOC, the AOC who entered Congress before the divisiveness of, the last 3 years, was an AOC who believed, possibly naively, that she could argue that all of these people have more in common than they have difference. And the race stuff has like just divided us in a way that is possibly irremediable. But that is her true naive hope, that she can argue to the laid off, auto workers and factory workers that they have more in common with a waitress in Queens than they think they do. And that if they bind together, they can make a movement. That's the idea. So I think she wants to talk to them. I think initially she got into Congress wanting to talk to them.
Mm-hmm. I don't think she expected to become, though, like this symbol, right? Like where like the Republican Party could just seize on anything that she said, and they could just like throw whatever crazy thing and just say like, this is what AOC and like the leftists and the socialists are saying. And that was perhaps like a little bit of naive, but also like, I mean, how could she have expected to become someone as hated as like someone like Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi, who have like a long history, right? Like they have been in the public eye for so long that of course they become like this, like, I would say in Virgo would call it like a Google, like this monster under the bed in a way. And I think that when she came with those ideas that we can form this type of coalitions and create this sort of like consciousness among like people from different backgrounds, she did not really expect that she was gonna become like such a target, in which, the ideas about her are already pretty cemented and like the minds of a lot of these people. And that definitely puts like a hamper on her political project, right?
100%.
Okay, another question. What's she like in private?
Well, we didn't meet her for this book, but I watched hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of video of her. Did you meet her, Andrea?
I met her, but it was so long ago, and it was also very like in out, half an hour interview, very media trained at that point. I go ahead, Lisa.
No, you go ahead.
I think that she's like a very warm person. One thing that struck me from that Knock Down the House Netflix documentary from a few years ago is the way that she interacts with children. To me, says a lot. She's the type of person who like sits down and like, pats her niece's hair and like talks to them very kindly. So to me, she seems like a very warm, family-oriented person. In many ways, she like, I have a cousin whose name is Alejandra, which is pretty close to Alexandria. And when I look at her family, I look at mine, is like, the type of person who I think could be in like my circles pretty easily, like a cousin, a sister, something like that. And the way that like she seems very warm, very relatable. I think she's pretty nerdy. We see this in her playing like Among Us, and how she talks about how she relaxes and everything. And going again to like the point of like family oriented, her relationship with her mom and her dad, I think, are like the most important relationships in her life, other than her partner now. So that I think also tells you a lot about how she would be in private, I would say.
There are two stories from reporting the book that stick out. One is that when she was running for Congress, before the primary, she was going to these house parties in neighborhoods in New York 14. And she was at a house party in Queens, and she came early and she was hanging out. And somebody spilled a glass of water on the rug, and she like rushed to clean it up. And the people who were throwing the house party said, like, we knew then that she was really authentic. Like, she was really real. Like, this is a woman who grew up with a mom who was cleaning houses, who worked in food service most of her 20s, for whom like a spilled glass of water is just something you clean up. It's just like, she didn't even think about it. It wasn't a gesture of anything. It was just completely normal and matter of fact. And that was the thing that made the people who were hosting the party love her. Like she's really real. And then, so that's, so three things. Another thing is that she talks about how she's disarming in person. You know, she's become this avatar of ferocity and you know, she's like a cartoon, right? She's like a cartoon superhero type person. But in person, people say that she's disarming, likable, charming, personable, personal. There's a video on, she was doing Instagram lives as a way to communicate to her constituents, her followers, after she was elected to Congress, after she was sworn in. And in the spring of her freshman year, she was having an extremely hard time. Everybody was hating on her about everything. And she was alone in her Washington apartment, eating fruit snacks and popcorn and putting together an IKEA table and yeah, an IKEA table. And she's just talking to the screen. And if you can find that video, it gives you such a wonderful sense of like what she's actually like, because you feel like she's just alone. She's having a hard time. It's after work. She's living in an apartment with no furniture. She's putting her furniture together. She likes putting, as Andrea says, she's nerdy. She likes putting together IKEA furniture. She likes the little map and the directions. And she's like joking about how she likes the map and the directions. And there's something so vulnerable about her and so like exposed about her. She just could be anybody. Like she could be anybody. She could be somebody that, you know, my daughter brings home from college. She could be a girlfriend of a relative. Like she could just be anybody in my life. So yeah.
I was about to say, just from reading the book, it seems like there's this very public facing side to her, and then also this very introspective, very private side to her that I don't think like a lot of people see. I think we probably have time for one more, 2 minutes. I'll do a quick one. What's the most surprising thing you learned about her?
I don't know. I'm going to quote from Andrea's piece, which is that when she would go to Puerto Rico in the summers, she would ride her cousin's horses without shoes.
Right,
Flip-flops. I just love the picture of her like living a life so different from the one that she is in right now. So
I would say something that did surprise me is the warmth in which like the people used to talk about her, right? Like we're so used to see her as like this strong person, or it's this like creepy like person's gonna come to steal your country, you know, like all these very cartoonish versions of who she is, and they're not true. So when you see how people who work closely together with her, people from her childhood remember like some of her best friends, the way that they speak about her, it just like made her to me more real that she's felt for like a really long time. And to me, like in the process of like reading Lisa's wonderful biographical part of the book, it just felt very, you know, she could be anyone that, you know, and I think that might be actually her superpower in a way.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I have one really quick rapid fire question to end on. Where's AOC going to be in 10 years? Where does she see herself? You know, you said that she thinks that, you know, anytime she's willing to and able to leave politics, what would it take for her to do that? And if she stayed in, where would she be? What are her aspirations?
Well, I'm going to quote from my colleague, Rebecca Traister, who wrote the introduction to this book, who has said, you know, Actually, it's pretty easy to see where she'll be in 10 years. She'll be a senator, or she'll run a media empire, or she'll be president, or she'll have some extremely powerful and lofty political adjacent position. I think it's much harder actually to see where she's going to be in 5 years if she wants to have children, if she wants to have children and stay in Congress, if she, like, how she's going to navigate moving from being a wunderkind to being an established politician who's also a Latina, is going to be a much harder transition. And those are the years that I think we should watch really, really carefully. And I credit Traister with that, not myself.
Anything you want to add? Anybody else?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I also think that we don't know because we haven't seen it be done before, right? Like, she's very much the first like female politician that we are seeing navigate very complicated questions about your life. Like, the majority of women that come into Congress and the Senate, governors, like, their child rearing years are behind there, right? They have established themselves professionally. Like, they've done so much more before they get to the House of Power in a way. And this is the first time that we are seeing her, like, the first person that we're seeing navigate a lot of those complicated questions. And I think she has a lot of like that internal conflict in a way too, like that desire just to run away and like use her power to say F it. It's like, I can't understand that, and I'm not in her position. So yeah, I think it's gonna be definitely interesting to see where she goes from here. We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah,
Well,
I think
oh, go ahead, please.
Oh, I'll be quick. I think she'll probably be senator. I think Chuck Schumer is scared to death that she's gonna like primary him or something. But I'd love to, I'd actually love to see her be like mayor of New York City. I think that would be a very different kind of job, and I think she could do something here.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I wish we had more time. I haven't had a chance to read the book. I'm really looking forward to it. And in particular, I'm curious to know so many things about her, like how she views herself as being unmarried, not just without children, but unmarried, and the halls of Congress. But I look forward to the book. As a general reminder to our audience out there, I've placed the link to purchase Take Up Space in the chat. It'll take you directly to the Politics and Prose website where you can purchase the book. While you're there, I hope you'll visit our events page. We'd love to see you in another event soon. In the meantime, thank you very much to our panel. Stay well and stay well read. Take care, everybody.